Hi, welcome to the Analysis Fact Checking Academy. My name is Sebastian Schra and I will be one of your presenters throughout this 6-week course. A little bit about myself: I'm a researcher and PhD student at the University of Vienna, and I'm working in the areas of misinformation, fact checking, and looking at the impacts on society from misinformation and disinformation. So in this first module, what we're going to look at fact-checking methodology. And basically, this is going to be a short introduction about fact-checking and misinformation, fact-checking and journalism, how they kind of have developed into distinct practices. Then we're going to look at fact-checking methodology, so the overarching structure of fact-checking, what you're kind of looking for, claim selection, contacting the speaker, these kinds of things, a very basic structure on how to understand the process of fact-checking. Then we're going to look at ethical standards, looking at things like non-partisanship and impartiality and why these are really important for being a fact-checker. And then at the last stage, we're going to look at cognitive biases and how they affect the fact-checking process, because we want to be mindful and make sure that when we're actually researching and conducting and publishing a fact check, we're really making sure that we're really just sticking to the facts. All right, so let's get into it. So fact checking has both a historical dimension and a contemporary dimension. So this is the traditional meaning of the word fact checking in journalism, and that relates to kind of the internal procedures for verifying facts prior to publishing an article or publishing a newspaper, for example. But it also means like this newer sense that's kind of the specific evaluation of the truthfulness or the veracity of statements made by politicians or public figures, or rumors or claims or conspiracy theories that might appear on social media or in wider society. So there's also this much newer kind of definition of fact-checking, which is really evaluating these public statements. And so it first emerged, the traditional version of fact-checking really came about in the 1920s and 30s as this sort of emerged as objectivity became much more of a norm in journalism. This is after the establishment of sort of, mass media as we kind of know it, and the shift towards more objective, factual-based reporting, shifting away from the yellow press and things like that. And whilst newspapers didn't typically employ, a dedicated fact checker, this is kind of the internal process and something that's so part of journalistic norms that fact checking is really, or having facts is one of the most integral components of being a journalist. So over the 20th century, we sort of see the development of the media, we see the development of newspapers, we see the development of print, and then we start seeing online. And then so in the early kind of 2000s, we start seeing this more almost separate form of external fact checking. And this kind of emerged in the early 2000s, especially with the arrival of platforms and organizations like Snopes and PolitiFact. And this has kind of been a response to the how the increasing complexity and volume of information circulating in society has increased. This is kind of a response to the increasing complexity and just the amount of information that we see. So while the concept of verifying the accuracy of information isn't really new, the formalization of fact-checking as a profession with distinct practices and sort of distinct aims and goals has really gained a lot of prominence in the latter half of the 20th century and the early 21st century, and has really continued to grow in importance in the digital age. And there are kind of distinctions between fact checkers and journalists, and this is kind of like distinct roles within the realms of news reporting or within the realms of working in a media organization. But very often they work in conjunction to provide accurate and informative content to the public. So while journalists are primarily focusing on gathering information, conducting interviews, investigating stories, writing news articles, they're working under kind of much tighter deadlines and need to report on sort of the current events. Whereas fact checkers are focusing more specifically on verifying the accuracy of information presented by public figures, presented by a politician, presented by kind of maybe a wide claim on social media, presented through speeches and so on. And their primary goal is really to ensure that the information provided to the public is truthful and based on evidence, and then verifying that these statements are true or false. Whereas journalists are using a lot of different methods to gather information, interviews, research, observation, analysis, and an important part of journalistic norm is that a lot of journalistic conception is based upon the idea of providing a balanced view to a story, so incorporating multiple perspectives. Whereas fact-checking is more about employing specific methodologies and tools, which you'll learn in the Fact-Checking Academy, to verify the accuracy of claims and statements. So this might be referencing primary resources, this might be consulting experts, analyzing data, this might be analyzing satellite imagery, this might be looking at whether a photo is manipulated or generated in some way. So you can kind of see that there's this difference between journalists and fact checkers is really kind of driven by role perceptions and epistemological considerations. And this is also kind of, due to, and why they've kind of split, or not split so much, but why they've become more distinct, is that due to the economic realities faced by newsrooms with declining amounts of money, with declining amounts of readership and so on, since there's less resources available, it's kind of driven a specific group of people to start going, okay, well, we're going to focus more on fact checking, we're going to focus more on verification and so on, because the unfortunate reality for a lot of newsrooms is there is very tight deadlines, very hard economic realities. And this is kind of something that's sort of pushed this distinction a little bit as well. Also, some fact-checking organizations have partnerships with social media corporations and other entities like Google, Meta, Twitter, X. And this is kind of something that, traditional journalists don't do. This is more fact checkers work in collaboration with the social media platform. They publish fact checks for the social media platform, and in your feed you'll see a story, and underneath the story there might be a warning label that says that this story is false, and it'll say who published the fact check and so on. And this is also something that's really more in the realms of dedicated fact checkers than just journalists. Now, when we're talking about fact checking, we're going to encounter terms like fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. And these terms are all kind of a little bit confusing because a lot of times we use them interchangeably, or even in different languages, the terms aren't used to represent all the same things, for example. Maybe some languages only use the term disinformation. So these three things at least mean different things, but they're used interchangeably. And it's kind of important to understand the difference between these three terms. So on the left, we've got fake news, and this kind of has evolved in its meaning as well. So originally, that just meant pseudo-journalistic disinformation. So stuff that was just deliberately misleading or manipulated, that had the appearance of actual journalistic news. So it's an imitation. It had a fake It had sort of the fake appearance of a news article. It was structured in a similar way to journalistic news. It had a headline, a text body, sometimes a picture, and the imitation of the news was presented in a misleading way. And this was intentional to make people believe that it actually resulted from journalistic research, which follows certain professional standards and then would be more believable to the person reading it. But now we've seen, in the last 10 years or so, fake news is also a label that can be applied by political actors who may use it to discredit, usually, legacy news media that don't support their political position. And this also has the implied or explicit suggestion that these media organizations are somehow politically biased against the speaker, against the person making the claim that this organization is fake news. So this fake news label is therefore like a weapon and has become part of political strategies which seek to undermine public trust in news media. So it kind of positions these organizations as like engaging in the spread of disinformation, and it serves an additional purpose to really sort of say these people are working against me, and it can even be used in certain instances by authoritarian leaders or people with authoritarian tendencies who can suggest that we need a fight against fake news, and this can justify censorship policies, this can intimidate journalists into self-censorship, it delegitimizes, the public role of journalism, it influences how the public perceives the media as well, and really can just decrease levels of trust in the media more broadly. So that's kind of like an overview of the different terms. In a later module, we'll look at misinformation and disinformation, and we'll look at some practical examples, and then we'll sort of see what the effects of misinformation and disinformation are. So thank you for joining me for the first part of Module 1, and we'll see you in the next module.